Welcome to the second reading of Madame Bovary. I am so glad that you are here to listen to this story. Part 1, Chapter 5. The brick front was just in line with the street, or rather the road. Behind the door hung a cloak with a small collar, a bridle, and a black leather cap. And on the floor, in a corner, were a pair of leggings, still covered with dry mud. On the right was the one apartment that was both dining and sitting room. A canary yellow paper, relieved at the top by a garland of pale flowers, was pocketed everywhere over the badly stretched canvas. White calico curtains with a red border hung crossways at the length of the window, and on the narrow mantelpiece a clock with a head of Hippocrates shone resplendent between two plate candlesticks under oval shades. On the other side of the passage was Charles's consulting room, a little room about 6 paces wide, with a table, 3 chairs, and an office chair, volumes of the Dictionary of Medical Science, uncut, but the binding rather the worse for the successive sales through which they had gone, occupied almost along the 6 shelves of a deal bookcase. The smell of melted butter penetrated through the walls when he saw patients, just as in the kitchen one could hear the people coughing in the consulting room and recounting their histories. Then, opening on the yard, where the stable was, came a large, dilapidated room with a stove, now used as a woodhouse, cellar, and pantry, full of rubbish, old empty casks, agricultural implements past service, and a mass of dusty things whose use it was impossible to guess. The garden, longer than wide, ran between 2 mud walls with espaliered apricots, to a hawthorn hedge that separated it from the field. In the middle was a slate sundial on a brick pedestal. 4 flower beds with eglantines surrounded symmetrically the more useful kitchen garden bed. Right at the bottom, under the spruce bushes, was a cure in plaster reading his breviary. Emma went upstairs. The first room was not furnished, but in the second, which was their bedroom, was a mahogany bedstead in an alcove with red drapery. A shell box adorned the chest of drawers, and on the secretary near the window a bouquet of orange blossoms tied with white satin ribbons stood in a bottle. It was a bride's bouquet. It was the other one's. She looked at it. Charles noticed it. He took it and carried it up to the attic, while Emma, seated in an armchair, they were putting her things down around her, thought of her bridal flowers packed up in a bandbox, and wondered, dreaming, what would be done with them if she were to die. During the first days, she occupied herself in thinking about changes in the house. She took the shades off the candlesticks, had new wallpaper put up, the staircase repainted, and seats made in the garden around the sundial. She even inquired how she could get a basin with a jet fountain and fishes. Finally, her husband, knowing that she liked to drive out, picked up a second-hand dog cart, which, with new lamps and splashboard in striped leather, looked almost like a Tilbury. He was happy then, and without a care in the world, a meal together, a walk in the evening on the high road, a gesture of her hands over her hair, the sight of her straw hat hanging from the window fastener, and many another thing in which Charles had never dreamed of pleasure, now made up the endless round of his happiness. In bed, in the morning, by her side, on the pillow, he watched the sunlight sinking into the down on her fair cheek, half hidden by the lapis of her nightcap. Seen thus closely, her eyes looked to him enlarged, especially when, on waking up, she opened and shut them rapidly, many times. Black in the shade, dark blue in broad daylight, they had, as it were, depths of different colors that, darker in the center, grew paler towards the surface of the eye. His own eyes lost themselves in these depths. He saw himself in miniature, down to the shoulders, with his handkerchief round his head and the top of his shirt open. He rose. She came to the window to see him off, and stayed leaning on the sill between two pots of geranium, clad in her dressing gown hanging loosely about her. Charles, in the street, buckled his spurs, his foot on the mounting stone, while she talked to him from above, picking with her mouth some scrap of flower or leaf that she blew out at him. Then this, eddying, floating, described semicircles in the air like a bird, and was caught before it reached the ground in the ill-groomed mane of the old white mare standing motionless at the door. Charles, from Backhorse, threw her a kiss. She answered with a nod. She shut the window, and he set off. And then, along the high road, spreading out its long ribbon of dust, along the deep lanes that the trees bent over as in arbors, along paths where the corner reached to the knees, with the sun on his back and the morning air in his nostrils, his heart full of the joys of the past night, his mind at rest, his flesh at ease, he went on, re-chewing his happiness, like those who after dinner taste again the truffles which they are digesting. Until now, what good had he had of his life? His time at school, when he remained shut up within the high walls, alone in the midst of companions richer than he or cleverer at their work, who laughed at his accent, who cheered at his clothes, and whose mothers came to school with cakes in their muffs. Later on, when he studied medicine and never had his purse full enough to treat some little work girl who would have become his mistress. Afterwards, he lived 14 months with the widow, whose feet in bed were cold as icicles. But now he had for life this beautiful woman whom he adored. For him, the universe did not extend beyond the circumference of her petticoat, and he reproached himself with not loving her. He wanted to see her again. He turned back quickly, ran up the stairs with a beating heart. Emma in her room was dressing. He came up on tiptoe, kissed her back. She gave a cry. He could not keep from constantly touching her comb, her ring, her fichu. Sometimes he gave her great-sounding kisses with all his mouth on her cheeks, or else little kisses in a row all along her bare arm, from the tip of her fingers up to her shoulder. And she put him away, half smiling, half vexed, as you do a child who hangs about you. Before marriage, she thought herself in love. But the happiness that should have followed this love not having come, she must, she thought, have been mistaken. And Emma tried to find out what one meant exactly in life by the words felicity, passion, rapture, that had seemed to her so beautiful in books. Part 1, Chapter 6. She had read Paul and Virginia, and she had dreamt of the little bamboo house, Domingo, the dog Fidel, but above all of the sweet friendship of some dear little brother, who seeks red fruit for you on trees taller than steeples, or who runs barefoot over the sand, bringing you a bird's nest. When she was 13, her father himself took her to town to place her in the convent. They stopped at an inn in Saint-Gervais Quarter, where at their supper they used painted plates that set forth the story of Mademoiselle de la Vallière. The explanatory legends, chipped here and there by the scratching of knives, all glorified religion, the tendernesses of the heart and the pomps of court. Far from being bored at first at the convent, she took pleasure in the society of the good sisters, who, to amuse her, took her to the chapel, which one entered from the refectory by a long corridor. She played very little during recreation hours, knew her catechism well, and it was she who always answered Monsieur le Vicaire's difficult questions. Living thus, without ever leaving the warm atmosphere of the classrooms, and amid these pale-faced women wearing rosaries with brass crosses, she was softly lulled by the mystic languor exhaled in the perfumes of the altar, the freshness of the holy water and the lights of the tapers. Instead of attending to Mass, she looked at the pious vignettes with the azure borders in her book, and she loved the sick lamb, the sacred heart pierced with sharp arrows, or the poor Jesus sinking beneath the cross he carries. She tried, by way of mortification, to eat nothing a whole day. She puzzled her head to find some vow to fulfill. When she went to confession, she invented little sins in order that she might stay there longer, kneeling in the shadow, her hands joined, her face against the grating beneath the whispering of the priest. The comparisons of betrothed, husband, celestial lover, and eternal marriage that recur in sermons stirred within her soul depths of unexpected sweetness. In the evening before prayer, there was some religious reading in the study. On weeknights it was some abstract of sacred history of the lectures of the Abbé Fresenius, and on Sundays passages from the Génie du Christianisme as a creation. How she listened at first to the sonorous lamentations of its romantic melancholies re-echoing through the world and eternity. If her childhood had been spent in the shop parlor of some business quarter, she might perhaps have opened her heart to those lyrical invasions of nature, which usually come to us only through translation in books. But she knew the country too well. She knew the lowing of cattle, the milking, the plows. Accustomed to calm aspects of life, she turned, on the contrary, to those of excitement. She loved the sea only for the sake of its storms, and the green fields only when broken up by ruins. She wanted to get some personal profit out of things, and she rejected as useless all that did not contribute to the immediate desires of her heart. Being of a temperament more sentimental than artistic, looking for emotions, not landscapes. At the convent, there was an old maid who came for a week each month to mend the linen, patronized by the clergy because she belonged to an ancient family of noblemen ruined by the Revolution. She dined in the refectory at the table of the good sisters, and after the meal had a bit of chat with them before going back to her work. The girls often slipped out from the study to go and see her. She knew by heart the love songs of the last century and sang them in a low voice as she stitched away. She told stories, gave them news, went errands in the town, and on the sly lent the big girls some novel that she always carried in the pockets of her apron, and of which the good lady herself swallowed long chapters in the intervals of her work. They were all love, lovers, sweethearts, persecuted ladies fainting in love pavilions, postilions killed at every stage, horses ridden to death on every page, somber forests, heartaches, vows, sobs, tears and kisses, little skiffs by moonlight, nightingales in shady groves, gentlemen brave as lions, gentle as lambs, virtuous as no one ever was, always well-dressed and weeping like fountains. For 6 months, then, Emma, at 15 years of age, made her hands dirty with books from old lending libraries. Through Walter Scott, later on, she fell in love with historical events, dreamed of old chests, guard-rooms, and minstrels. She would have liked to live in some old manor house, like those long-waisted chatelaines, who, in the shade of pointed arches, spent their days leaning on the stone, chin in hand, watching a cavalier with white plume galloping on his black horse from the distant fields. At this time, she had a cult for Mary Stuart and enthusiastic veneration for illustrious or unhappy women. Joan of Arc, Eloise, Agnès Sorel, the beautiful Ferronnier, and Clemence Isaure stood out to her like comets in the dark immensity of heaven, where also were seen, lost in shadow and all unconnected, Saint Louis with his oak, the dying Bayard, some cruelties of Louis XI, a little of St. Bartholomew's Day, the plume of the Bernay, and always the remembrance of the plates painted in honor of Louis XIV. In the music class, in the ballads, she sang, there was nothing but little angels with golden wings, Madonnas, legumes, gondoliers, mild compositions that allowed her to catch a glimpse athwart the obscurity of style and the weakness of the music, of the attractive phantasmagoria of sentimental realities. Some of her companions brought keepsakes, given them as New Year's gifts to the convent. These had to be hidden. It was quite an undertaking. They were read in the dormitory. Delicately handling the beautiful satin bindings, Emma looked with dazzled eyes at the names of the unknown authors who had signed their verses for the most part as counts or viscounts. She trembled as she blew back the tissue paper over the engraving and saw it folded in two and fall gently against the page. Here behind the balustrade of a balcony was a young man in a short cloak, holding in his arm a young girl in a white dress, wearing an alms bag at her belt. Or there were nameless portraits of English ladies with fair curls, who looked at you from under their round straw hats with their large, clear eyes. Some they were lounging in the carriages, gliding through parks, a greyhound bounding along in front of the equipage driven at a trot by two midget postilions in white breeches. Others, dreaming on sofas with an open letter, gazed at the moon through a slightly open window half draped by a black curtain. The naive ones, a tear on their cheeks, were kissing doves through the bars of a Gothic cage, or, smiling, their heads on one side were plucking the leaves off a marguerite with their taper fingers that curved at the tip like peaked shoes. And you, too, were there, sultans with long pipes reclining beneath arbors in the arms of bayadiers, jaours, Turkish sabres, Greek caps, and you especially, pale landscapes of dithyrambic lands that often show us at once palm trees and firs, tigers on the right, a lion to the left, Tartar minarets on the horizon, the whole framed by a very neat virgin forest and with a great perpendicular sunbeam trembling in the water, where, standing out in relief like white excoriations on a steel-grey ground, swans are swimming about. And the shade of the argand lamp fastened to the wall above Emma's head lighted up all these pictures of the world that passed before her one by one in the silence of the dormitory, and to the distant noise of some belated carriage rolling over the boulevards. When her mother died, she cried much the first few days. She had a funeral picture made with the hair of the deceased, and, in a letter sent to the Bertaux, full of sad reflections on life, she asked to be buried later on in the same grave. The goodman thought she must be ill and came to see her. Emma was secretly pleased that she had reached at a first attempt the rare ideal of pale lives, never attained by mediocre hearts. She let herself glide along the Lamartine meanderings, listened to harps on lakes, to all the songs of dying swans, to the falling of the leaves, the pure virgins ascending to heaven, and the voice of the Eternal discoursing down the valleys. She wearied of it, would not confess it, continued from habit, and at last was surprised to feel herself soothed, and with no more sadness at heart than wrinkles on her brow. The good nuns, who had been so sure of her vocation, perceived with great astonishment that Mademoiselle Rouault seemed to be slipping from them. They had indeed been so lavish to her of prayers, retreats, novenas, and sermons. They had so often preached the respect due to saints and martyrs, and given so much good advice as to the modesty of the body and salvation of her soul, that she did as tightly reined horses. She pulled up short, and the bit slipped from her teeth. This nature, positive in the midst of its enthusiasms, that had loved the church for the sake of the flowers, and music for the words of the songs, and literature for its passional stimulus, rebelled against the mysteries of faith as it grew irritated by discipline, a thing antipathetic to her constitution. When her father took her from school, no one was sorry to see her go. The Lady Superior even thought that she had latterly been somewhat irreverent to the community. Emma, at home once more, first took pleasure in looking after the servants, then grew disgusted with the country and missed her convent. When Charles came to the Bertaux for the first time, she thought herself quite disillusioned, with nothing more to learn and nothing more to feel. But the uneasiness of her new position, or perhaps the disturbance caused by the presence of this man, had sufficed to make her believe that she, at last, felt that wondrous passion which, till then, like a great bird with rose-colored wings, hung in the splendor of the skies of poesy. And now she could not think that the calm in which she lived was the happiness she had dreamed. Part 1, Chapter 7. She thought sometimes that, after all, this was the happiest time of her life. The honeymoon, as people called it. To taste the full sweetness of it, it would have been necessary, doubtless, to fly to those lands, with sonorous names, where the days after marriage are full of laziness, most suave, and post chaises behind blue silken curtains, to ride slowly up steep road, listening to the song of the postilion re-echoed by the mountains, along with the bells of goats and the muffled sound of a waterfall. At sunset, on the shores of gulfs, to breathe in the perfume of lemon trees. Then, in the evening, on the villa terraces above, hand in hand, to look at the stars, making plans for the future. It seemed to her that certain places on earth must bring happiness, as a plant peculiar to the soil, and that cannot thrive elsewhere. Why could not she lean over balconies in Swiss chalets, or enshrine her melancholy in a Scotch cottage, with a husband dressed in a black velvet coat with long tails and thin shoes, a pointed hat and frills? Perhaps she would have liked to confide all these things to someone, but how tell an undefinable uneasiness, variable as the clouds, unstable as the winds? Words failed her. The opportunity, the courage. If Charles had but wished it, if he had guessed it, if his look had but once met her thought, it seemed to her that a sudden plenty would have gone out from her heart, as the fruit falls from the tree when shaken by a hand. But as the intimacy of their life became deeper, the greater became the gulf that separated her from him. Charles's conversation was commonplace as a street pavement, and everyone's ideas trooped through it in their everyday garb, without exciting emotion, laughter, or thought. He had never had the curiosity, he said, while he lived in Rouen, to go to the theatre, to see the actors from Paris. He could neither swim, nor fence, nor shoot, and one day he could not explain some term of horsemanship to her that she had come across in a novel. A man, on the contrary, should he not know everything, excel in manifold activities, initiate you into the energies of passion, the refinements of life, all mysteries? But this one taught nothing, knew nothing, wished nothing. He thought her happy, and she resented this easy calm, this serene heaviness, the very happiness she gave him. Sometimes she would draw, and it was great amusement to Charles to stand there bolt upright and watch her bend over her cardboard, with eyes half closed to better see her work, or rolling between her fingers little bread pellets. As to the piano, the more quickly her fingers glided over it, the more he wondered. She struck the notes with aplomb and ran from top to bottom of the keyboard without a break. Thus shaken up, the old instrument, whose strings buzzed, could be heard at the other end of the village when the window was open. And often the bailiff's clerk, passing along the high road, bareheaded and in list slippers, stopped to listen, his sheet of paper in his hand. Emma, on the other hand, knew how to look after her house. She sent the patient's accounts in well-phrased letters that had no suggestion of a bill. When they had a neighbor to dinner on Sundays, she managed to have some tasty dish, piled up pyramids of green gages on vine leaves, served up preserves turned out into plates, and even spoke of buying finger glasses for dessert. From all this, much consideration was extended to Bovary. Charles finished by rising on his own esteem for possessing such a wife. He showed with pride in the sitting room 2 small pencil sketches by her that he had framed in very large frames and hung up against the wallpaper by long green cords. People returning from Mass saw him at his door in his wool work slippers. He came home late, at 10 o'clock, at midnight sometimes. Then he asked for something to eat, and as the servant had gone to bed, Emma waited on him. He took off his coat to dine more at ease. He told her, one after the other, the people he had met, the villages where he had been, the prescriptions he had written, and, well pleased with himself, he finished the remainder of the boiled beef and onions, picked pieces of the cheese, munched an apple, emptied his water bottle, and then went to bed, and lay on his back and snored. As he had been for a time accustomed to wearing nightcaps, his handkerchief would not keep down over his ears, so that his hair in the morning was all tumbled pell-mell about his face and whitened with the feathers of the pillow, whose strings came untied during the night. He always wore thick boots that had 2 long creases over the instep running obliquely towards the ankle, while the rest of the upper continued in a straight line, as if stretched on a wooden foot. He said that was quite good enough for the country. His mother approved of his economy, for she came to see him as formerly when there had been some violent row at her place. And yet, Madame Bovary Senior seemed prejudiced against her daughter-in-law. She thought her race too fine for their position. The wood, the sugar, and the candles disappeared, as at a grand establishment, and the amount of firing in the kitchen would have been enough for 25 courses. She put her linen in order for her in the presses, and taught her to keep an eye on the butcher when he brought the meat. Emma put up with these lessons. Madame Bovary was lavish of them, and the words daughter and mother were exchanged all day long, accompanied by little quiverings of the lips, each one uttering gentle words in a voice trembling with anger. In Madame de Bousse's time, the old woman felt that she was still the favorite, but now the love of Charles for Emma seemed to her a desertion from her tenderness, an encroachment upon what was hers, and she watched her son's happiness in sad silence, as a ruined man looks through the windows at people dining in his old house. She recalled to him as remembrances her troubles and her sacrifices, and comparing these with Emma's negligence, came to the conclusion that it was not reasonable to adore her so exclusively. Charles knew not what to answer. He respected his mother, and he loved his wife infinitely. He considered the judgment of the one infallible, and yet he thought the conduct of the other irreproachable. When Madame Bovary had gone, he tried timidly and in the same terms to hazard 1 or 2 of the more anodyne observations he had heard from his mamma. Emma proved to him with a word that he was mistaken, and sent him off to his patients. And yet, in accord with theories she believed right, she wanted to make herself in love with him. By moonlight in the garden she recited all the passionate rhymes she knew by heart, and, sighing, sang to him many melancholy adagios. But she found herself as calm as before, and Charles seemed no more amorous and no more moved. When she had thus, for a while, struck the flint on her heart without getting a spark, incapable, moreover, of understanding what she did not experience as of believing anything that did not present itself in conventional forms. She persuaded herself without difficulty that Charles's passion was nothing very exorbitant. His outbursts became regular. He embraced her at certain fixed times. It was one habit among other habits, and like a dessert, looked forward to after the monotony of dinner. A gamekeeper, cured by the doctor of inflammation of the lungs, had given Madame a little Italian greyhound. She took her out walking, for she went out sometimes in order to be alone for a moment, and not to see before her eyes the eternal garden and the dusty road. She went as far as the beaches of Banville, near the deserted pavilion which forms an angle of the wall on the side of the country. Amidst the vegetation of the ditch, there are long reeds with leaves that cut you. She began by looking around her to see if nothing had changed since last she had been there. She found again in the same places the foxgloves and wallflowers, the beds of nettles growing around the big stones, and the patches of lichen along the 3 windows, whose shutters, always closed, were rotting away on the rusty iron bars. Her thoughts, aimless at first, wandered at random like her greyhound, who ran around and around in the fields, yelping after the yellow butterflies, chasing the shrew mice, or nibbling the poppies on the edge of a cornfield. Then, gradually, her ideas took definite shape, and sitting on the grass that she dug up with little prods of her sunshade, Emma repeated to herself, "Good heavens, why did I marry?" She asked herself if by some other chance combination it would have not been possible to meet another man, and she tried to imagine what would have been these unrealized events, this different life, this unknown husband. All surely could not be like this one. He might have been handsome, witty, distinguished, attractive, such as, no doubt, her old companions of the convent had married. What were they doing now? In town, with the noise of the streets, the buzz of the theatres and the lights of the ballroom. They were living lives where the heart expands, the senses burgeon out. But her life was cold as a garret whose dormer window looks onto the north, and ennui, the silent spider, was weaving its web in the darkness in every corner of her heart. She recalled the prize days, when she mounted the platform to receive her little crowns, with her hair in long plaits. In her white frock and open prunella shoes, she had a pretty way. And when she went back to her seat, the gentlemen bent over her to congratulate her. The courtyard was full of carriages. Farewells were called to her through their windows. The music master with his violin case bowed in passing by. How far all of this? How far away? She called Jolly, took her between her knees, and smoothed the long delicate head, saying, "Come, kiss mistress, you have no troubles." Then, noting the melancholy face of the graceful animal, who yawned slowly, she softened, and comparing her to herself, spoke to her aloud as to somebody in trouble whom one is consoling. Occasionally there came gusts of winds, breezes from the sea rolling in one sweep over the whole plateau of the whole coal country, which brought even to these fields a salt freshness. The rushes, close to the ground, whistled. The branches trembled in a swift rustling, while their summits, ceaselessly swaying, kept up a deep murmur. Emma drew her shawl round her shoulders and rose. In the avenue, a green light, dimmed by the leaves, lit up the short moss that crackled softly beneath her feet. The sun was setting, the sky showed red between the branches, and the trunks of the trees, uniform and planted in a straight line, seemed a brown colonnade standing out against the background of gold. A fear took hold of her. She called Jolly and hurriedly returned to Toast by the high road, threw herself into an armchair, and for the rest of the evening did not speak. But towards the end of September, something extraordinary fell upon her life. She was invited by the Marquis d'Andervilliers to Vaubyessard, Secretary of State to the Restoration. The Marquis, anxious to re-enter political life, set about preparing for his candidature to the Chamber of Deputies long beforehand. In the winter, he distributed a great deal of wood, and in the Conseil Général always enthusiastically demanded new roads for his arrondissement. During the dark days, he had suffered from an abscess, which Charles had cured, as if by miracle, by giving a timely little touch with the lancet. The steward, sent to Toast to pay for the operation, reported in the evening that he had seen some superb cherries in the doctor's little garden. Now, cherry trees did not thrive in Vaubyessard. The Marquis asked Bovary for some slips, made it his business to thank him personally, saw Emma, thought she had a pretty figure, and that she did not bow like a peasant, so that he did not think that he was going beyond the bounds of condescension, nor, on the other hand, making a mistake in inviting the young couple. On Wednesday, at 3 o'clock, Monsieur and Madame Bovary, seated in the dog-cart, set out for Vaubyessard, with a great trunk strapped on behind and a bonnet box in front of the apron. Besides these, Charles held the bandbox between his knees. They arrived at nightfall, just as the lamps in the park were being lit to show the way for the carriages. Part 1, Chapter 8. The chateau, a modern building in Italian style, with 2 projecting wings and 3 flights of steps, lay at the foot of an immense green sward on which some cows were grazing among groups of large trees set out at regular intervals, while large beds of arbutus, rhododendron, syringas, and guelder roses bulged out their irregular clusters of green along the curve of the gravel path. A river flowed under a bridge. Through the mist, one could distinguish buildings with thatched roofs scattered over the field, bordered by 2 gently sloping, well-timbered hillocks, and in the background, amid the trees, rose in 2 parallel lines the coach-houses and stables. All that was left of the ruined old chateau. Charles's dog-cart pulled up before the middle flight of steps. Servants appeared. The Marquis came forward, and, offering his arm to the doctor's wife, conducted her to the vestibule. It was paved with marble slabs, was very lofty, and the sound of footsteps and that of voices re-echoed through it as in a church. Opposite rose a straight staircase, and on the left a gallery overlooking the garden led to the billiard room, through whose door one could hear the click of the ivory balls. As she crossed it to go to the drawing room, Emma saw standing round the table men with grave faces, their chins resting on high cravats. They all wore orders and smiled silently as they made their strokes. On the dark wainscoting of the walls, large gold frames bore at the bottom names written in black letters. She read, Jean-Antoine d'Andervilliers d'Yvonville, Count de la Vaubyessard, and Baron de la Fresnay, killed at the Battle of Courtas on the 20th of October, 1587. And on another, Jean-Antoine Henri Guy d'Andervilliers de la Vaubyessière, Admiral of France and Cavalier of the Order of St. Michael, wounded at the Battle of the Hogue-Saint-Vaast on the 29th of May, 1692, died at Vaubyessard on the 23rd of January, 1693. One could hardly make out those that followed, for the light of the lamps lowered over the green cloth threw a dim shadow round the room. Burnishing the horizontal pictures, it broke up against these in delicate lines, where there were cracks in the varnish. And from all these, the great black squares framed in with gold stood out here and there some lighter portion of the painting. A pale brow, 2 eyes that looked at you, perukes flowing over and powdering red-coated shoulders, or the buckle of a garter above a well-rounded calf. The Marquis opened the drawing-room door. One of the ladies, the Marchioness herself, came to meet Emma. She made her sit down by her on an ottoman, and began talking to her as amicably as if she had known her a long time. She was a woman of about 40, with fine shoulders, a hook nose, a drawling voice, and on this evening she wore over her brown hair a simple guipure fichu that fell in a point at the back. A fair young woman sat in a high-backed chair in a corner, and gentlemen with flowers in the buttonholes were talking to ladies round the fire. At 7, dinner was served. The men, who were in the majority, sat down at the first table in the vestibule. The ladies at the second in the dining room with the Marquis and Marchioness. Emma, on entering, felt herself wrapped round by a warm air, a blending of the perfume of flowers and of the fine linen, of the fumes of the viands and the odor of the truffles. The silver dish covers reflected the lighted wax candles in the candelabra. The cut crystal covered with light steam reflected from one to the other pale rays. Bouquets were placed in a row the whole length of the table, and in the large bordered plates, each napkin, arranged after the fashion of a bishop's mitre, held between its 2 gaping folds a small oval-shaped roll. The red claws of lobsters hung over the dishes. Rich fruit in open baskets was piled up on moss. There were quails in their plumage. Smoke was rising, and in silk stockings, knee breeches, white cravat, and frilled shirt, the steward, grave as a judge, offered ready carved dishes between the shoulders of the guests. With a touch of the spoon gave you the piece chosen. On the large stove of porcelain inlaid with copper baguettes, the statue of a woman, draped to the chin, gazed motionless on the room full of life. Madame Bovary noticed that many ladies had not put their gloves in their glasses. But at the upper end of the table, along almost all these women, bent over his full plate and his napkin tied around his neck like a child, an old man sat eating, letting drops of gravy drip from his mouth. And he wore a little queue tied with black ribbon. He was the Marquis's father-in-law, the old Duke de la Vedière, once on a time favorite of the Count d'Artois, in the days of the Vaudreuil hunting parties at the Marquis de Conflans, and had been, it was said, the lover of Queen Marie Antoinette, between Monsieur de Coigny and Monsieur de Lauzun. He had lived a life of noisy debauch, full of duels, bets, elopements. He had squandered his fortune and frightened all his family. A servant behind his chair named aloud to him in his ear the dishes that he pointed to, stammering, and constantly Emma's eyes turned involuntarily to this old man with hanging lips, as to something extraordinary. He had lived at court and slept in the bed of queens. Iced champagne was poured out. Emma shivered all over as she felt it cold in her mouth. She had never seen pomegranates, nor tasted pineapples. The powdered sugar even seemed to her whiter and finer than elsewhere. The ladies afterwards went to their rooms to prepare for the ball. Emma made her toilet with the fastidious care of an actress on her debut. She did her hair according to the directions of the hairdresser, and put on the barège dress spread out upon the bed. Charles's trousers were tied across the belly. "My trouser straps will be rather awkward for dancing," he said. "Dancing?" repeated Emma. "Yes." "Why, you must be mad. They would make fun of you. Keep your place. Besides, it is more becoming for a doctor," she added. Charles was silent. He walked up and down, waiting for Emma to finish dressing. He saw her from behind in the glass between two lights. Her black eyes seemed blacker than ever. Her hair, undulating towards the ears, shone with a blue luster. A rose in the chignon trembled on its mobile stalk, with artificial dewdrops on the tip of the leaves. She wore a gown of pale saffron, trimmed with 3 bouquets of pom-pom roses mixed with green. Charles came and kissed her on her shoulder. "Let me alone," she said. "You are tumbling me." One could hear the flourish of the violin and the notes of a horn. She went downstairs, restraining herself from running. Dancing had begun. Guests were arriving. There was some crushing. She sat down on a form near the door. The quadrille over, the floor was occupied by groups of men standing up and talking, and servants in livery bearing large trays. Along the line of seated women, painted fans were fluttering. Bouquets half hid smiling faces, and gold-stoppered scented bottles were turned in partly closed hands, whose white gloves outlined the nails and tightened on the flesh at the wrist. Lace trimmings, diamond brooches, medallion bracelets trembled on bodices, gleamed on breasts, clinked on bare arms. The hair, well smoothed over the temples and knotted at the nape, bore crowns or bunches, or sprays of mitosotis, jasmine, pomegranate blossoms, ears of corn, and corn flowers. Calmly seated in their places, mothers with forbidding countenances were wearing red turbans. Emma's heart beat rather faster when her partner, holding her by the tips of the fingers, she took her place in a line with the dancers and waited for the first note to start. But her emotion soon vanished, and, swaying to the rhythm of the orchestra, she glided forward with slight movements of the neck. A smile rose to her lips at certain delicate phrases of the violin that sometimes played alone while the other instruments were silent. One could hear the clink of the louis d'or that were being thrown down upon the card tables in the next room. Then all struck again. The cornet piston uttered its sonorous note. Feet marked time, skirts swelled and rustled, hands touched and parted. The same eyes falling before you met yours again. A few men, some 15 or so, of 25 to 40, scattered here and there among the dancers or talking at the doorways, distinguished themselves from the crowd by a certain air of breeding, whatever the differences in age, dress, or face. Their clothes, better made, seemed of finer cloth, and their hair brought forward in curls towards the temples, glossy with more delicate pomades. They had the complexion of wealth, that clear complexion that is heightened by the parlor of porcelain, the shimmer of satin, the veneer of old furniture, and that an ordered regime of exquisite nurture maintains at its best. Their necks moved easily in their low cravats. Their long whiskers fell over the turned-down collars. They wiped their lips upon handkerchiefs with embroidered initials that gave forth a subtle perfume. Those who were beginning to grow old had an air of youth, while there was something mature in the faces of the young. In their unconcerned looks was the calm of passions daily satiated, and through all their gentleness of manner pierced that peculiar brutality, the result of a command of half-easy things, in which force is exercised and vanity amused, the management of thoroughbred horses, and the society of loose women. A few steps from Emma, a gentleman in a blue coat was talking of Italy with a pale young woman wearing a parure of pearls. They were praising the breadth of the columns of St. Peter's, Tivoli, Vesuvius, Castellamare, and Cassine, the roses of Genoa, the Colosseum by moonlight. With her other ear, Emma was listening to a conversation full of words she did not understand. A circle gathered round a very young man who the week before had beaten Miss Arabella and Romulus, and won 2,000 louis jumping a ditch in England. One complained that his racehorses were growing fat, another of the printer's errors that had disfigured the name of his horse. The atmosphere of the ball was heavy, the lamps were growing dim. Guests were flocking to the billiard room. A servant got up a chair and broke the window panes. At the crash of the glass, Madame Bovary turned her head and saw in the garden the faces of peasants pressed against the window looking in at them. Then the memory of the Berthaud came back to her. She saw the farm again, the muddy pond, her father in a blouse under the apple trees, and she saw herself again as formerly, skimming with her finger the cream off the milk pans in the dairy. But in the refulgence of the present hour, her past life, so distinct until then, faded away completely, and she almost doubted having lived it. She was there. Beyond the ball was only shadow overspreading all the rest. She was just eating a maraschino ice that she held with her left hand in a silver gilt cup, her eyes half closed, and a spoon between her teeth. A lady near her dropped her fan. A gentleman was passing. "Would you be so good," said the lady, "as to pick up my fan that has fallen behind the sofa?" The gentleman bowed, and as he moved to stretch out his arm, Emma saw the hand of a young woman throw something white, folded in a triangle, into his hat. The gentleman, picking up the fan, offered it to the lady respectfully. She thanked him with an inclination of the head and began smelling her bouquet. After supper, where were plenty of Spanish and Rhine wines, soups à la bisque and au lait d'almond, puddings à la Trafalgar, and all sorts of cold meats with jellies that trembled in the dishes. The carriages, one after the other, began to drive off. Raising the corners of the muslin curtain, one could see the light of the lanterns glimmering through the darkness. The seats began to empty. Some card players were still left. The musicians were cooling the tips of their fingers on their tongues. Charles was half asleep, his back propped against the door. At 3 o'clock, the cotillon began. Emma did not know how to waltz. Everyone was waltzing. Mademoiselle d'Andervilliers herself and the Marquis. Only the guests staying at the castle were still there, about a dozen persons. One of the waltzers, however, who was familiarly called Viscount, and whose low-cut waistcoat seemed molded to his chest, came a second time to ask Madame Bovary to dance, assuring her that he would guide her and that she would get through it very well. They began slowly, then went more rapidly. They turned. All around them was turning. The lamps, the furniture, the wainscoting, the floor, like a disc on a pivot. On passing near the doors, the bottom of Emma's dress caught against his trousers. Their legs commingled. He looked down at her. She raised her eyes to his. A torpor seized her. She stopped. They started again, and with more rapid movement, the Viscount, dragging her along, disappeared with her to the end of the gallery, where, panting, she almost fell, and for a moment rested her head upon his breast. And then, still turning, but more slowly, he guided her back to her seat. She leaned back against the wall and covered her eyes with her hands. When she opened them again, in the middle of the drawing room, 3 waltzers were kneeling before a lady sitting on a stool. She chose the Viscount, and the violin struck up once more. Everyone looked at them. They passed and repassed, she with rigid body, her chin bent down, and he always in the same pose, his figure curved, his elbow rounded, his chin thrown forward. That woman knew how to waltz. They kept up a long time and tired out all the others. Then they talked a few moments longer, and after the good nights, or rather good mornings, the guests of the chateau retired to bed. Charles dragged himself up by the balusters. His knees were going up into his body. He had spent 5 consecutive hours standing bolt upright at the card tables, watching them play whist, without understanding anything about it, and it was with a deep sigh of relief that he pulled off his boots. Emma threw a shawl over her shoulders, opened the window, and leaned out. The night was dark. Some drops of rain were falling. She breathed in the damp wind that refreshed her eyelids. The music of the ball was still murmuring in her ears, and she tried to keep herself awake in order to prolong the illusion of this luxurious life that she would soon have to give up. Day began to break. She looked long at the windows of the chateau, trying to guess which were the rooms of all those she had noticed the evening before. She would fain have known their lives, have penetrated, blended with them, but she was shivering with cold. She undressed and cowered down between the sheets against Charles, who was asleep. There were a great many people to luncheon. The repast lasted 10 minutes. No liqueurs were served, which astonished the doctor. Next, Mademoiselle d'Andervilliers collected some pieces of roll in a small basket to take them to the swans on the ornamental waters, and they went to walk in the hothouses, where strange plants, bristling with hairs, rose in pyramids on the hanging vases, whence, as from overfilled nests of serpents, fell long green cords interlacing. The orangery, which was at the other end, led by a covered way to the outhouses of the chateau. The Marquis, to amuse the young woman, took her to see the stables. Above the basket-shaped racks, porcelain slabs bore the names of the horses in black letters. Each animal in its stall whisked its tail when anyone went near, and said, "Chick, chick." The boards of the harness room shone like the flooring of a drawing room. The carriage harness was piled up in the middle against two twisted columns, and the bits, the whips, the spurs, the curbs were ranged in a line all along the wall. Charles, meanwhile, went to ask a groom to put his horse to. The dog cart was brought to the foot of the steps, and, all the parcels being crammed in, the Bovarys paid their respects to the Marquis and Marchioness and set out again for toast. Emma watched the turning wheels in silence. Charles, on the extreme edge of the seat, held the reins with his two arms wide apart, and the little horse ambled along in the shafts that were too big for him. The loose reins hanging over his crupper were wet with foam, and the box fastened on behind the chaise gave regular bumps against it. They were on the heights of Thibourville, when suddenly some horsemen with cigars between their lips passed laughing. Emma thought she recognized the Viscount, turned back, and caught on the horizon only the movement of the heads, rising or falling with the unequal cadence of the trot or gallop. A mile farther on, they had to stop to mend with some string the traces that had broken. But Charles, giving a last look to the harness, saw something on the ground between his horse's legs, and he picked up a cigar case with a green silk border and a bell blazoned in the center like the door of a carriage. "There are even 2 cigars in it," said he. "They'll do for this evening after dinner." "Why, do you smoke?" she asked. "Sometimes, when I get a chance." He put his find in his pocket and whipped up the nag. When they reached home, the dinner was not ready. Madame lost her temper. Anastasie answered rudely. "Leave the room," said Emma. "You are forgetting yourself. I give you warning." For dinner, there was onion soup and a piece of veal with sorrel. Charles, seated opposite Emma, rubbed his hands gleefully. "How good is it to be at home again?" Anastasie could be heard crying. He was rather fond of the poor girl. She had formerly, during the wearisome time of his widowhood, kept him company many an evening. She had been his first patient, his oldest acquaintance in the place. "Have you given her warning for good?" he asked at last. "Yes. Who is to prevent me?" she replied. Then they warmed themselves in the kitchen while their room was being made ready. Charles began to smoke. He smoked with lips protruding, spitting every moment, recoiling at every puff. "You'll make yourself ill," she said scornfully. He put down his cigar and ran to swallow a glass of cold water at the pump. Emma seized hold of the cigar case, threw it quickly to the back of the cupboard. The next day was a long one. She walked about her little garden, up and down the same walks, stopping before the beds, before the espalier, before the plaster curate, looking with amazement at all these things of once on a time that she knew so well. How far off the ball seemed already. What was it that thus set so far asunder the morning of the day before yesterday and the evening of today? Her journey to Vaubyessard had made a hole in her life, like one of those great crevices that a storm will sometimes make in one night in the mountains. Still, she was resigned. She devoutly put away in her drawers her beautiful dress, down to the satin shoes whose soles were yellowed with the slippery wax of the dancing floor. Her heart was like these. In its friction against wealth, something had come over it that could not be effaced. The memory of this ball, then, became an occupation for Emma. Whenever the Wednesday came round, she said to herself as she woke, "Ah, I was there a week, a fortnight, 3 weeks ago." And little by little, the faces grew confused in her remembrance. She forgot the tune of the quadrilles. She no longer saw deliveries and appointments so distinctly. Some details escaped her, but the regret remained with her.